The room was already smiling before she opened her mouth. The signing hall glowed with soft lights and polished wood, the kind of place where people spoke in measured tones and believed the future had already been decided. Executives sat in the front rows, lawyers whispered to one another, cameras waited for the moment everyone expected. I stood slightly off to the side, my badge turned just enough that no one bothered reading it. That was normal. That was where people like me were supposed to stand. My sister-in-law leaned in toward a small group near the aisle, her voice carrying easily. She had always known how to find the center of a room without raising her volume. Someone mentioned paperwork, schedules, the final steps before the signatures. She laughed and waved a hand in my direction. "Emily just handles the admin side," she said lightly. "The big decisions are taken care of." A few people chuckled. Not cruelly, not loudly, just enough to seal the moment. I didn't smile. I didn't correct her. I didn't feel the familiar spike of embarrassment either. I simply watched the laughter ripple and fade, watched her settle back into confidence, watched the room return to its calm certainty. 5 minutes later, that certainty would collapse into silence. But at that moment, no one knew. And I let them keep believing their version of me. Because this wasn't the first time she'd called me just admin. It was only the first time she'd done it right before the truth was spoken out loud. By then, I had stopped correcting her years earlier. I had learned that correcting people didn't change the story they wanted to tell. It only made me look defensive, like I was trying to borrow importance that didn't belong to me. So I stood where I was, hands loosely folded, eyes on the stage, letting the moment pass without resistance. My name is Emily Carter. I was 29 that year, and in my husband's family, I had a role so clearly defined that no one ever thought to question it. I was the organized one, the calm one, the woman who handled details so other people could focus on what mattered. At least, that was how they liked to say it. It sounded harmless when they said it like that, almost complimentary, until you realized that details meant anything invisible, and what mattered was reserved for other people. My sister-in-law had been the one to set that tone early on. She was sharp, quick, confident in the way that drew attention without effort. In family gatherings, she spoke for groups, made decisions out loud, laughed easily when people deferred to her. When she entered a room, conversations adjusted around her. When I entered, people handed me things, phones to hold, papers to sort, questions to pass along. At first, I thought it was temporary. I was new to the family, careful not to overstep. Helping felt like a way to belong. I printed schedules, organized shared calendars, smoothed over small misunderstandings before they grew teeth. I told myself it was practical. I told myself it didn't matter. The first time she joked about me being admin, I laughed with everyone else. The second time, I smiled. By the third, it had become a pattern, a shorthand, a role no one asked me if I wanted. In that hall, watching her make the same joke again, I felt something quieter than anger settle in. Not resignation, recognition. I had spent a long time thinking that if I worked hard enough, people would eventually see what I actually did, that my effort would speak for itself. What I hadn't understood back then was that people rarely listen to work they don't bother to look at. The signing event itself had been months in the making. A major partnership, the kind that justified press coverage and formal speeches. My sister-in-law's husband held a senior position at the partner company, and the deal had been spoken about in the family as if it were already a success story. A done thing, a victory waiting to be announced. At dinners leading up to the event, the language was always the same. When this goes through, after the signing, once everything's finalized, no one ever said if, and no one ever asked me anything beyond whether the schedule had been sent or the documents printed correctly. That was the part that amused me in a distant way. Not one of them had asked what I actually did at my job. They had assumed the answer years ago and stopped listening after that. I could feel the energy in the room shifting as people took their seats. A low hum of anticipation settled over the hall. The moderator glanced at his notes. The photographers adjusted their lenses. From where I stood, I could see my sister-in-law a few rows ahead, her posture relaxed, her expression satisfied. She believed this moment belonged to her family. In a way it did, just not in the way she thought. I wasn't on stage. I wasn't meant to be. My role, in their minds, had already been assigned. I was there to support, to facilitate, to disappear into the background once everything ran smoothly. And for a long time, that had been enough to keep the peace. What they didn't know, what no one in that hall had any reason to suspect, was that my silence was an agreement. It wasn't obedience. It wasn't fear. It was distance. I had learned how to stand close enough to hear everything and far enough away to remain unseen. I had learned how information moved through rooms like this, how decisions formed long before they were announced, how certainty was often just confidence without inspection. The lights dimmed slightly, signaling the start. The moderator stepped forward, clearing his throat, and the hum died down. My sister-in-law leaned toward her husband, whispering something that made him smile. She didn't look at me again. I didn't look at her either. I focused on the stage, on the podium, on the words that were about to be spoken. I knew what was coming. I had known for weeks. And as the room settled into expectant quiet, I realized that this was the first time in a long while that I wasn't waiting to be dismissed. Everyone walked into that room believing the decision was already made. They were wrong. Years before that signing, before the joke felt automatic, before my silence became expected, I still believed I could correct the story if I spoke up at the right moment. I remembered the first time I was quietly given a role in that family. It wasn't announced or argued. It happened the way these things usually do, in the middle of something ordinary. A dinner table crowded with plates and overlapping conversations. Someone asked about travel plans. Another person couldn't find an email. I offered to help, standing up from my chair to check my phone, to pull up the confirmation, to smooth over the confusion. My sister-in-law smiled at me then, a friendly, approving smile. "She's great with details," she said to the table. "Our little admin." People laughed. I laughed too. It sounded harmless, affectionate even. I didn't realize I had just agreed to a version of myself I would spend years trying to escape. At the beginning, helping felt like participation. I was new to the family, still learning where I fit. Being useful seemed safer than being visible. I organized shared calendars for holidays. I drafted emails no one else wanted to write. I remembered birthdays, deadlines, reservations. When something went wrong, I fixed it quietly before it became anyone else's problem. No one asked me to do these things. That was the part that made it complicated. I volunteered because I wanted things to run smoothly, because chaos made me anxious, because I had always believed that competence would eventually be noticed. What I didn't see at first was how quickly helpful turned into expected. The joke came back again, always dressed a little differently, but carrying the same message. At a family brunch, when someone asked who was coordinating plans, my sister-in-law answered before I could. "Emily's on it," she said. "She lives for that stuff." At a work-related gathering, when paperwork was mentioned, she gestured toward me with a knowing look. "Admin magic," she called it. "She keeps everything moving." Each time there were smiles, nods, agreement. And each time I felt myself shrink just a little more. I told myself it wasn't worth making a fuss, that correcting her would only make me seem sensitive, insecure, ungrateful. The tone was always light after all. Who argues with a joke? Who insists on redefining themselves in the middle of someone else's laughter? Once I tried. We were sitting in the living room after dinner, conversation drifting toward work. Someone asked what I was doing these days, and before I could answer, my sister-in-law cut in. "Still handling admin things," she said. "She's always been good at that." "I actually work in operations," I said, keeping my voice even. "There's more to it than—" She laughed, not unkindly, and waved a hand. Right. Operations, admin. Same difference." The room moved on. Someone changed the subject. My words fell flat, unfinished, and I felt foolish for having tried. It wasn't that she had disagreed with me. It was that she hadn't listened at all. That was the moment something shifted inside me. I realized that correcting them didn't challenge the role they'd given me. It only highlighted how uncomfortable they were with the idea that I might be something else. And that discomfort would always be smoothed over in favor of the easier story. So I stopped. Not all at once, not dramatically, all at once. I simply let their version of me stand unchallenged. If they wanted to think I handled schedules and paperwork, I let them. If they assumed my work was small, I didn't argue. I learned how to answer questions vaguely, how to nod without explaining, how to keep my professional life separate from family conversations. It wasn't surrender. It was strategy, even if I didn't fully recognize it at the time. What they never noticed was that while they were laughing about admin work, I was learning how systems actually functioned, how decisions were supported long before they were announced, how authority often depended on the quiet work no one bothered to acknowledge. At home, I was invisible. At work, I was becoming essential. That contrast grew sharper over time. At family events, no one asked what I was working on. They asked if I could send reminders, print documents, coordinate logistics. At the office, people asked for my input. They asked me to review processes, flag inconsistencies, double-check assumptions. They trusted me with details that had real consequences. I lived between those two realities without letting them touch. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered if I was complicit in my own erasure, if my silence was just another form of self-betrayal. But then I thought about the alternative, about constantly correcting people who didn't want to be corrected, about insisting on space in a room that had already decided where I belonged. Silence, I learned, could be a form of survival. By the time the signing event was scheduled, the pattern was firmly set. My sister-in-law spoke. Others listened. I handled what needed handling. No one questioned it. And I didn't challenge it because I no longer needed their understanding to validate my work. What I hadn't anticipated was how closely those two worlds were about to collide. The assignment that came across my desk a few weeks later didn't look remarkable at first. Just another review. Another set of documents to examine. Another opportunity to do the kind of work no one noticed unless it was missing. I opened the file, scanned the summary, and felt a familiar focus settle in. This was what I did. This was where I was sharp, attentive, calm. The name of the partner company didn't register immediately. It was just another organization, another set of numbers, another system to understand. I didn't know yet that the work I was about to do would tear straight through the careful separation I'd built between my family and my profession. I didn't know that the role they'd laughed about for years had quietly prepared me for a moment none of them saw coming. All I knew, as I leaned closer to the screen and began to read, was that something about this file felt off. Not wrong in a way that demanded alarm, just misaligned, uneven. The kind of feeling that comes when patterns don't quite match the story being told. At that point, it was just another task. I had no idea it would become the line I would finally refuse to cross. No one in my family ever asked what I actually did all day. At work, that question came up constantly. "Can you take a look at this? Does this timeline make sense? Something feels off here. Can you check it before we move forward?" Those questions followed me through my days, quiet acknowledgments of trust that never made it home with me. Admin was the word they used because it was small enough to dismiss. At the office, my title was longer, less convenient, and it didn't fit neatly into a joke. I worked in operations, which meant I lived in the space between decisions and consequences. I didn't announce strategies or close deals, but I made sure the ground they stood on didn't give way beneath them. Most mornings started the same way. Coffee cooling beside my keyboard, inbox already filling, documents waiting to be reviewed. I tracked timelines, compared versions, cross-checked assumptions against reality. I learned to read past polished summaries and into the margins where the real story lived. When something didn't line up, I didn't raise my voice. I made a note. There was a strange freedom in being overlooked. People talked around me as if I wasn't there, assuming my presence was purely logistical. They spoke candidly in meetings, confident that the person taking notes was only recording, not evaluating. They forgot that the person with access to everything eventually understands everything. The first time someone truly listened to me, it caught me off guard. It was during a project review that had gone sideways. A deadline had been missed, and no one could quite explain why. The room buzzed with frustration, fingers pointed at vendors, and miscommunication. I sat quietly, scanning the documents spread across the table, noticing a detail no one else had mentioned. The timeline they were blaming didn't match the approvals they had signed off on. The delay wasn't accidental. It was built in. I cleared my throat, almost apologetic. "There's a gap here," I said, pointing to a line buried in the report. "This approval came after the deliverable date. We couldn't have met it." The room went still. Someone leaned closer. Another asked me to repeat myself. I did, this time with more confidence. Questions followed. The blame shifted. The meeting changed direction. Afterward, my manager stopped by my desk. "Good catch," she said. "You see things others don't." I shrugged, unsure how to respond. To me, it wasn't insight. It was pattern recognition. It was what happened when you paid attention long enough. From then on, I was invited into more conversations, not as a speaker, not as a decision maker, but as a presence. I sat in rooms where money moved and reputations were shaped, listening more than I talked. I watched how certainty was often manufactured and how risk was brushed aside in favor of momentum. That was when I understood something fundamental. Power didn't belong solely to the loudest voice. It belonged to the person who understood how the pieces fit together. Admins sat where information passed through. When the assignment that would change everything landed on my desk, it didn't feel dramatic. There was no announcement, no special meeting, just a folder labeled with a project name and a request to conduct a standard risk review before an upcoming partnership. I opened it without ceremony. At first glance, the numbers looked fine. Growth was steady. Projections were optimistic, but not outrageous. The executive summary was confident, well-written, reassuring. This was the kind of file most people skimmed before nodding approval. I didn't skim. I traced the timelines, followed the dependencies, compared stated capacity against actual delivery history. I noticed how often milestones had been revised after the fact, how issues were resolved just in time, not sustainably, how success seemed to hinge on a few individuals carrying an outsized load. It wasn't catastrophic. That was the problem. The risks were quiet, systemic, easy to ignore if you wanted a yes. As I dug deeper, a name began to appear more often than others, attached to updates, referenced in internal notes, credited with holding things together when pressure mounted. I paused, then scrolled back to the cover page and read the company name again more carefully. My stomach tightened. It was my sister-in-law's husband's company. For a long moment, I stared at the screen, the hum of the office fading into the background. I hadn't known. No one had flagged it as a conflict. From their perspective, there wasn't one. My role was technical, supportive. I was just admin, after all. I reported the connection immediately, keeping my message factual and brief. My manager acknowledged it with a nod. "As long as you're comfortable staying objective," she said, "if anything feels compromised, we'll adjust." I was comfortable. More than that, I was certain. The work didn't change because of who was involved. The patterns were still there. The risks didn't soften out of consideration for family dinners or shared holidays. If anything, the familiarity sharpened my focus. I knew how easily charm and confidence could mask deeper issues. I had lived with that dynamic for years. I kept working. The more I reviewed, the clearer the picture became. Strong ideas, weak follow-through. A culture that rewarded speed over stability. None of it was malicious. None of it was trivial. It was the kind of situation that looked impressive on the surface and fractured under pressure. I compiled my findings carefully, supporting every observation with documentation. I avoided loaded language. I didn't speculate. I didn't personalize. The report spoke in calm, measured terms about risk exposure and sustainability. When I sent it up the chain, I felt a familiar steadiness settle in. The same feeling I had when correcting a timeline or flagging an inconsistency. This was the job. This was the responsibility. At home, no one noticed anything different. My sister-in-law continued to joke about my role. Family conversations revolved around the upcoming signing as if it were a celebration already won. They spoke about future plans with a confidence that felt almost fragile to me now, built on assumptions no one had bothered to examine. I listened. I smiled when appropriate. I didn't offer commentary. There was a strange symmetry to it all. The work they dismissed was the work that mattered most in moments like this. The silence they expected from me was the silence that would soon speak the loudest. As I closed the file late one evening, the office quiet around me, I knew I had crossed a point of no return. Not because of the outcome, whatever it would be, but because I had finally stopped pretending that staying small was the same thing as staying safe. At that point, it was still just another report. I didn't yet know it would be read aloud in a room full of people who had never bothered to read me at all. I closed the file and sat back, letting the quiet of the office settle around me. Nothing in the report screamed disaster. That was what made it dangerous. The risks I'd flagged were subtle, the kind that hid behind confidence and momentum, missed timelines that had been reframed as strategic pivots, capacity stretched thin but described as agility, success that depended on a few people holding everything together through sheer force of will. It all looked impressive until you imagine what would happen if one piece slipped. I knew how often people ignored that kind of warning, especially when they wanted a deal to go through. At home, no one was interested in warnings. The closer we got to the signing, the louder the certainty became. At a family dinner the weekend before, the conversation circled the event like it was already a victory. My sister-in-law talked about seating arrangements and speeches, about how good it would look for the family. Her husband smiled easily, comfortable in the knowledge that his company was about to step into something bigger. "This is basically done," someone said, raising a glass. "Just paperwork now." She laughed and glanced at me. "Emily's world," she said. "Forms, signatures, all the boring stuff." I smiled thinly and took a sip of water. No one noticed. They were already talking about what came next. I could have said something then. I could have mentioned concerns, softened the ground, prepared them for the possibility that things weren't as locked in as they believed. I didn't. Not because I wanted to surprise them, but because that kind of warning would have crossed a line. It wouldn't have been advice. It would have been interference. The joke followed me everywhere that week. At a small gathering with extended family, at a casual meetup with friends connected to the business world. Each time, my sister-in-law delivered it with the same easy confidence, as if repeating it made it more true. "She keeps us organized," she said once, patting my arm. "Without her, nothing would get done." It sounded generous. It wasn't. I didn't react. I didn't correct her. I focused instead on my work, on preparing for the signing with the same care I brought to everything else. Schedules were checked, documents were reviewed, logistics were confirmed. And quietly, officially, my report moved through the channels it was meant to. I wrote my recommendation the same way I wrote everything. Clearly, carefully, without emotion. I stated the risks, supported them with data, and outlined why moving forward now would expose the company to long-term instability. I didn't mention family. I didn't mention relationships. The work stood on its own. The night before the signing, I sat alone at my kitchen table, the report open in front of me. I read it one last time, not to change it, but to remind myself why it existed. I thought about how easy it would be to soften a sentence, to emphasize potential over risk, to make everything sound just safe enough. I didn't. I sent the final version and closed my laptop. For the first time in days, my phone stayed silent. The morning of the signing arrived crisp and bright, the kind of day that felt designed for celebration. The venue was already buzzing when I arrived. Security checked badges. Staff moved with practiced efficiency. The air carried that familiar mix of coffee, cologne, and anticipation. I took my place where I'd been assigned, off to the side, close enough to see everything and invisible enough to be ignored. My sister-in-law arrived shortly after, perfectly composed, greeting people with the ease of someone who believed she belonged there. Her husband followed, relaxed, confident, already shaking hands like the future was his to accept. Neither of them looked at me for more than a second. I watched the room fill, executives settled into their seats, lawyers arranged their folders, cameras found their angles. Everyone wore the same expression, a quiet satisfaction that comes from believing the hard part is over. That belief pressed against me from all sides. As the minutes ticked down, I felt the weight of what was coming, not as fear, but as gravity. There was no turning back now. Not because of pride or stubbornness, but because the process had already moved beyond personal choice. The decision would be made the way decisions were supposed to be made, without regard for who laughed last. I caught a glimpse of my name on the internal program as someone adjusted a stack of papers near the stage, just a line among many others. I looked away before anyone noticed me noticing. My sister-in-law leaned over to her husband and whispered something that made him grin. She glanced back at me then, just briefly, her expression amused, almost fond. I knew what she was thinking, that this moment belonged to them, that I was part of the background, a helpful presence who would fade once the important people took their places. I let her believe it. The moderator stepped forward, tapping the microphone lightly. Conversations tapered off. The room drew itself into focus. I straightened my posture, not out of nerves, but habit. This was the moment everything I had worked on quietly would pass from preparation into consequence. As the opening remarks began, I felt oddly calm. The report was no longer mine. The decision was no longer personal. Whatever happened next would happen because of what was written, not because of who had written it. Everyone in that room thought they knew how the story ended. I stood there, listening, knowing they were about to learn how wrong that assumption was. The room felt smaller once everyone sat down, not physically. The hall was still wide and polished, the ceiling high enough to echo every cough and shuffle. But expectation has a way of compressing space. People leaned forward in their seats, programs folded neatly in their laps, eyes trained on the stage where the final steps were about to unfold. I sat where my badge had directed me, a few rows back and off to the side, not close enough to be seen as important, not far enough to leave early. Exactly where someone like me was supposed to be. My sister-in-law was 2 rows ahead, angled slightly toward the aisle. She looked relaxed, almost bored, the way people do when they believe the outcome is guaranteed. Her husband sat beside her, shoulders loose, chin lifted. He nodded along to the opening remarks as if they were a formality he'd already mentally skipped past. The moderator spoke about collaboration, about shared vision, about months of preparation and mutual trust. The language was polished and familiar, designed to make everyone comfortable with what was about to happen. During a brief pause, someone near my sister-in-law mentioned documents, signatures, the final sequence of approvals. She laughed softly and turned her head just enough for her voice to carry. "Emily just handles the paperwork," she said, gesturing vaguely behind her. "The real decisions were made long ago." There it was again. The line delivered so smoothly it barely registered as an insult. A few people smiled. Someone chuckled. The moment slid by, light and forgettable to everyone except me. I didn't react. I didn't look at her. I didn't feel the urge to shrink or defend myself. Instead, I felt something settle into place, like a piece clicking where it had always belonged. The moderator cleared his throat and adjusted the microphone. "And now," he said, "before we proceed to the signing itself, I'd like to acknowledge the teams whose work informed today's decision." The tone shifted, subtle but noticeable. A few heads tilted, pens were picked up, cameras adjusted their focus. He thanked departments in broad strokes: legal, finance, operations. Each mention met with polite applause. I kept my gaze steady, my hands still, my breathing even. "Risk assessment and due diligence," he continued, "played a critical role in our final determination." The word determination landed heavier than the others. He glanced down at his notes. "Based on the analysis and recommendations provided, we've concluded that moving forward at this time would expose both parties to unnecessary long-term risk." A ripple moved through the room. It wasn't panic. Not yet. More like confusion, the first crack in an expected narrative. "We've therefore decided to pause the partnership pending further review." Silence followed. Not the respectful kind that waits for applause cues. The kind that happens when people are recalibrating. My sister-in-law straightened slightly. Her husband's smile faltered, just for a second. The moderator continued, calm and measured. "I want to specifically acknowledge the work of the operations review team," he said. "In particular, the comprehensive risk evaluation led by Emily Carter." My name cut through the quiet like a blade. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't emphasized. It was simply read, clear and unembellished, as if it had always belonged there. For a moment, nothing moved. Then chairs creaked as people turned, heads pivoted in unison, searching for the person they'd just been told mattered. I felt eyes land on me, curious, assessing, recalculating. I didn't stand. I wasn't asked to. I didn't wave or smile. I stayed exactly where I was, posture straight, expression neutral. The moderator went on, describing the process in professional terms. Patterns identified, systemic concerns, recommendations grounded in data rather than optimism. The words flowed over the room, stripping away assumptions piece by piece. My sister-in-law didn't turn around at first. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her spine stiffened as understanding crept in against her will. Her husband turned more quickly. The color drained from his face, replaced by something raw and unguarded. His jaw tightened. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the stage, as if willing the words to change. They didn't. The moderator thanked the teams again and invited everyone to remain for the next segment of the program. No applause followed, not immediately. People were too busy processing the shift beneath their feet. I felt no surge of triumph, no rush of vindication. What I felt was steadiness. This wasn't a reveal. It was a correction. I finally glanced toward my sister-in-law. She had turned halfway in her seat now, just enough to see me. Her mouth was slightly open, the easy confidence gone, replaced by something close to disbelief. She didn't look angry. She looked frozen. For years, she had laughed at a version of me that made sense to her. A smaller version, a useful one. Now, confronted with a reality she hadn't bothered to examine, she had nowhere to put it. The room began to stir again. Whispers bloomed, hushed but urgent. Phones appeared in hands. Notes were scribbled in margins. The program moved on, as programs always do, indifferent to personal reckonings. I remained seated until the end of the segment, then stood quietly and gathered my things. No one stopped me. No one congratulated me. A few people nodded as I passed, eyes thoughtful rather than impressed. As I stepped into the aisle, I caught one last glimpse of my sister-in-law. She was staring straight ahead now, jaw set, eyes unfocused. Her husband leaned toward her, whispering something urgent, his composure fraying. I didn't wait to hear it. I walked out of the hall at a measured pace, the sound of conversation swelling behind me. The world outside felt brighter, louder, unchanged. 5 minutes earlier, they had laughed at a joke. Now, the room was silent where it mattered most. And for the first time, no one was telling my story, but the truth itself. The event continued as if nothing had happened. Panels shifted, schedules moved forward, and people found new conversations to step into. By the time I reached the quieter hallway outside the main hall, the hum of the room had already reassembled itself. Whatever had frozen inside my family was invisible to everyone else. My phone vibrated before I reached the exit. I didn't answer it. I stepped outside into the sharp afternoon light, letting the doors close behind me. For a few seconds, I stood there breathing, listening to the distant city noise, grounding myself in the fact that the decision was no longer theoretical. It was real now, public, irreversible. The phone buzzed again, then again. When I finally looked at the screen, the name waiting there wasn't a surprise. It never is. Family always moves fastest when something goes wrong. I answered on the fourth call. "What happened in there?" my sister-in-law asked, skipping any greeting. Her voice was tight, carefully controlled. "Did you know about this?" I didn't pretend not to understand. "Yes," I said. There was a pause. I could hear her breathing, shallow and uneven. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked. "You could have warned us." "Warned us." The phrase landed exactly where it always had. "I didn't have anything to warn you about," I said. "I did my job." "That's not what I mean," she snapped. "You knew how important this was. You knew what this deal meant for our family." I leaned against the cool stone wall and closed my eyes briefly. That's exactly why I couldn't interfere. She let out a short, humorless laugh. "So you just let it happen? You let them read your name out like that, like some kind of statement?" "It wasn't a statement," I said. "It was a report." The line went quiet. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted, softer now, careful. "You didn't have to make it so final," she said. "You could have framed it differently, emphasized the positives, balanced things out." There it was. The request they never called a request, the expectation wrapped in reasonableness. No one was asking me to lie. They would say, just to smooth the edges, just to make it easier. "I didn't exaggerate anything," I said, "and I didn't leave anything out." "But you could revisit it," she pressed. "Clarify, add context. People listen to you now. You have influence." I opened my eyes and stared at the concrete at my feet. That influence exists because I don't use it that way. Her breath caught. "So, you're just going to let this blow up?" "I'm going to let it be what it is." She went quiet again, longer this time. When she spoke, the edge was gone, replaced by something closer to disbelief. "You really won't fix this," she said. The word fix echoed between us. For years, that had been my role. The fixer, the smoother, the person who absorbed tension so others didn't have to feel it. "No," I said, "I won't." The call ended without goodbye. I stood there for a moment longer, phone still in my hand, feeling the familiar pull of guilt creep in. Not regret. Guilt is quieter than that. It asks questions without accusing. It wonders if there was another way. I walked away before it could settle too deeply. The next call came an hour later from her husband. He didn't bother pretending to be calm. "You blindsided us," he said. "You had a responsibility to say something." "I fulfilled my responsibility," I replied. "To who?" he shot back. The question hung between us, raw and revealing. "To my role," I said. "To the process? To the people affected by the risks you didn't want to look at." He scoffed. "This wasn't about risk. This was personal." "No," I said. "It just feels that way, because you're used to things going your way." Silence followed, heavy, charged. "You think you're above us now," he said finally. I exhaled slowly. "I think you're asking me to be smaller so you don't have to be uncomfortable." He hung up. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table with the report open in front of me. I read it again, line by line, searching for the crack they insisted must be there. The sentence I could soften, the phrase I could reframe. There wasn't one. The facts were still the facts. The patterns still existed. Changing the language wouldn't change the truth. It would only change who I was willing to become to protect it. Messages kept coming, some angry, some pleading, some pretending to be neutral while circling the same expectation. Just help us smooth this over. Just do what you always do. For the first time, I didn't answer any of them. The realization came quietly, almost gently. They weren't upset because the deal was paused. They were upset because I hadn't stepped in to absorb the impact, because I hadn't translated consequences into something more comfortable. They weren't asking for fairness. They were asking for silence. The next day, the tone changed again, cooler, distant. Conversations ended quickly. Invitations were phrased vaguely or not at all. The family dynamic adjusted itself around my refusal, finding new paths that didn't include me. It hurt more than I expected, not because I doubted my choice, but because I could finally see the shape of my value to them. How conditional it had always been. How easily it vanished when I stopped performing it. By the end of the week, the call stopped. No one asked me to fix anything anymore. No one asked me for help. The space I had once filled collapsed inward, leaving a silence that felt both heavy and clean. That was when I understood what I had actually done. I hadn't punished anyone. I hadn't taken revenge. I had simply stepped out of a role they had built their comfort around. And for the first time, they didn't know how to replace me. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about a deal. It was about whether I was willing to live with the cost of not fixing things anymore. The silence that followed was different from any I had known before. It wasn't the awkward quiet after an argument or the polite pause people used to change the subject. This silence had weight. It stretched across days and weeks, filling spaces that had once been crowded with expectations. My phone stayed still. No reminders to send, no questions to answer, no problems quietly slid in my direction to be smoothed away. For the first time, I wasn't needed. At first, that felt like relief. I woke up without the familiar tension in my chest, without bracing myself for someone else's urgency. I moved through my days with a steadiness I hadn't realized was missing. Work remained busy, focused, demanding in the way I respected. Home was quiet. Evenings stretched longer than they used to. Then the relief thinned, giving way to something sharper. I started noticing the gaps. A family group chat that went silent after my last message. Photos posted from gatherings I hadn't been invited to. Conversations that ended quickly when I entered a room, as if everyone had agreed, without saying so, to keep certain things from reaching me. No one accused me outright. No one said I was wrong. Instead, the story shifted sideways. Through careful comments and half-explanations, I learned the new version of me being shared. I was difficult now, rigid, someone who had let professional ambition outweigh family loyalty. The tone wasn't angry. It was disappointed, which somehow hurt more. I had gone from just admin to the one who made things complicated. At work, the aftershock rippled differently. No one questioned the report. The decision stood, supported by finance and legal reviews that echoed the same concerns I'd raised. Officially, I was in the clear. Unofficially, I felt eyes on me more often. Colleagues weighed their words, measuring how close they stood, as if integrity were contagious. A senior manager stopped by my desk one afternoon and said quietly, "You handled that well." It wasn't praise. It was recognition of the cost. I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. There were no promotions or sudden rewards, no dramatic validation, just a subtle shift in how I was regarded. People listened a little more carefully. They asked questions differently. The work continued, steady and demanding, without offering comfort. It was fair. It was honest. The hardest moments came in the spaces where confrontation never happened. A birthday passed without a call. A holiday invitation arrived late and vague, phrased in a way that allowed my absence without explanation. When I did attend one gathering, I felt like a guest in a room that used to expect me to manage it. Conversations flowed around me, not toward me. Someone else struggled to coordinate plans, and no one looked my way. I realized then that my value had never been about who I was. It had been about what I provided. Losing that role hurt more than losing approval. It meant letting go of the illusion that I belonged unconditionally, that my place in the family existed beyond my usefulness. Late one night, alone in my apartment, I asked myself the question I'd been avoiding. Had I gone too far? I replayed the moments in my mind. The report, the call, the refusal to soften the edges. I imagined a version of myself who had made a different choice, who had warned them privately, who had adjusted the language just enough to protect everyone's comfort. In that version, the deal might have survived a little longer. The family dinners would have stayed warm. My phone would still ring, and I would still be fixing things that were never mine to fix. The answer settled slowly, unmistakably. It wasn't the timing that had broken the peace. It was the fact that I had stopped making myself smaller to preserve it. They didn't want the truth earlier or later. They wanted it shaped in a way that didn't disrupt their certainty. That realization hurt. It also clarified everything. As weeks passed, the shift became more pronounced. Requests stopped entirely, not even the casual ones. I was no longer the default solution, the quiet backup plan. Without me absorbing friction, small conflicts surfaced and lingered. Schedules overlapped. Messages went unanswered. I heard about it secondhand, the mild chaos settling where I had once stood. I didn't step in, not out of spite, out of respect for the boundary I had drawn. There was a moment, standing in the grocery store one evening, when the weight of it all pressed down at once. I watched a family argue gently over a shopping list, laughing as they sorted it out together, and felt the sting of something close to grief. Not for what I'd lost, for what I'd never truly had. I had wanted a place where I could be seen without performing, where my work and my presence didn't have to earn permission, where I could speak without recalculating the cost. That place didn't exist in my family. Not as long as I was willing to trade myself for harmony. The silence remained, but it changed shape. It became space, space to breathe, Space to decide what I wanted my life to look like without constantly translating myself for others. Space to build something quieter, sturdier, my own. I stopped checking my phone so often. I stopped rehearsing explanations I was no longer willing to give. I let the narrative they told about me drift without correction, the same way I had once let the admin joke pass. Only this time, the silence was mine. By the end of that season, I understood the cost clearly. Not fixing things meant loneliness, distance, being misunderstood by people who preferred the version of me that made their lives easier. Fixing things would have meant losing myself entirely. For the first time, I chose to live with the cost. Life didn't explode after that. It settled. Weeks passed, then months, and nothing dramatic announced itself as the aftermath. No headlines, no sudden reversals, just a quieter rhythm that took time to get used to. I woke up, went to work, came home. I cooked for myself more often. I stopped waiting for my phone to light up with questions that weren't really questions. The distance with my family didn't close, but it stabilized. It stopped feeling like an open wound and started feeling like a boundary that had finally healed enough to hold its shape. They learned to manage without me, not gracefully, not efficiently, but on their own. I noticed it in small ways, events that ran late because no one had double-checked the schedule, messages that crossed wires because no one had taken the time to clarify, decisions delayed because no one wanted to be the one responsible. I heard about these things in passing, through mutual acquaintances, through awkward half-laughs meant to soften the truth. No one asked me to step back in. No one called me just admin again either. When I did see my sister-in-law, months later at a neutral gathering, she was different, quieter, more careful. She didn't make jokes at my expense or speak for me without looking first. There was no apology, no dramatic acknowledgement of what had changed, just a new awareness, like someone who had finally realized they'd been standing on something fragile all along. Her husband avoided me entirely. I didn't chase either of them. I didn't need to. The shift had already happened. What surprised me most was how my relationship with myself changed. For years, I had confused usefulness with belonging. I believed that if I kept things running smoothly, I would earn my place. That silence was the price of harmony. That being easy to overlook was better than being difficult to deal with. I don't believe that anymore. The silence I live with now is different. It isn't about swallowing words or shrinking to fit someone else's comfort. It's a chosen quiet, the kind that comes from not needing to prove anything. At work, I continued doing what I had always done, reviewing, evaluating, asking questions that mattered. The deal that had been paused never moved forward in the same way again. Other projects came and went. My name appeared on documents, then disappeared back into the process, exactly where it belonged. No one made a spectacle of it, and that was fine. Sometimes, late in the evening, I thought back to that moment in the hall, the way the room had gone still when my name was read aloud. Not because I enjoyed the memory, but because I finally understood what it meant. It wasn't about power over my family. It wasn't about watching someone else freeze. It was about being seen accurately, if only for a moment. For the first time, the version of me that existed in other people's minds matched the one I lived with every day. Not the helper, not the punchline, not the invisible support behind someone else's success. Just a professional doing her job, standing by her work. That moment didn't fix everything. Real life doesn't offer that kind of neat ending. There were still holidays I spent alone. Still conversations that felt careful and distant. Still the quiet grief of knowing that some people only love the version of you that asks for nothing in return. But there was also something else. A steadiness I hadn't known before. A sense of alignment that made the loneliness bearable and the peace real. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't confront anyone publicly. I didn't demand apologies or explanations. I simply stopped making myself smaller. That was enough. If you're listening to this and it feels familiar, if you've ever been labeled in a way that made you easier to dismiss, I want you to know something. The role people assign you is not the limit of who you are. And silence doesn't always mean agreement. Sometimes it's preparation. Sometimes the most powerful moment comes when you let the truth speak for itself and you refuse to clean up the discomfort it creates. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew you? Have you ever chosen to hold your ground instead of fixing things for everyone else? Share your experience in the comments. These stories don't end when the video does. And if you're drawn to stories about quiet strength, about boundaries, about people who stop apologizing for taking up space, consider staying here. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. There are more stories like this, and you're welcome to be part of the conversation. The woman they laughed at didn't argue or explain. She just stood where she was, exactly as she had always been. And that changed everything. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.